Introducing the Shahnama book. The Shahname or Shahnama, the Book of Kings, pronounced, is a long epic poem written by the Persian poet FERDOWSI between c. 977 and 1010 CE and is the national epic of Greater Iran. Consisting of some 50,000 distichs, or couplets, two-line verses, the Shahname is one of the world's longest epic poems. It tells mainly the mythical and to some extent the historical past of the Persian Empire from the creation of the world until the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. Iran, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan and the greater region influenced by Persian culture such as Armenia, Dagestan, Georgia, Turkey, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan celebrate this national epic. The work is of central importance in Persian culture and Persian language, regarded as a literary masterpiece, and definitive of the ethno-national cultural identity of Iran. Composition: Rostam cycle, fragment of the Penjikent murals in the Hermitage Museum. 7th to 8th century. FERDOWSI started writing the Shahname in 977 and completed it on the 8th of March 1010. The Shahname is a monument of poetry and historiography, being mainly the poetical recast of what FERDOWSI, his contemporaries, and his predecessors regarded as the account of Iran's ancient history. Many such accounts already existed in prose, an example being the Abu Mansuri Shahname. A small portion of FERDOWSI's work, in passages scattered throughout the Shahname, is entirely of his own conception. The Shahname is an epic poem of over 50,000 couplets written in early New Persian. It is based mainly on a prose work of the same name compiled in FERDOWSI's earlier life in his native Tus. This prose Shahname was in turn and for the most part the translation of a Pahlavi, Middle Persian, work, known as the SHAHNAME, Book of Kings, a late Sasanian compilation of the history of the kings and heroes of Persia from mythical times down to the reign of Khosrau II, 590 to 628. The SHAHNAME contained historical information on the FERDOWSI added material continuing the story to the overthrow of the Sasanians by the Muslim armies in the middle of the 7th century. The first to undertake the versification of the Pahlavi chronicle was Dakiki, a contemporary of FERDOWSI, poet at the court of the Samanid Empire, who came to a violent end after completing only 1,000 verses. These verses, which deal with the rise of the prophet Zoroaster, were afterward incorporated by FERDOWSI, with acknowledgement, in his own poem. The style of the Shahname shows characteristics of both written and oral literature. Some claim that FERDOWSI also used Zoroastrian nasks, such as the now lost Shaddad, as sources as well. Many other Pahlavi sources were used in composing the epic, prominent being the Karnamag-i Ardaksir-i Pabagan, which was originally written during the late Sassanid era and gave accounts of how Ardashir I came to power which, because of its historical proximity, is thought to be highly accurate. The text is written in the late Middle Persian, which was the immediate ancestor of modern Persian. A great portion of the historical chronicles given in Shahname is based on this epic and there are in fact various phrases and words which can be matched between FERDOWSI's poem and this source, according to Zabihullah Safa. Content: Beaker, Minai Ware, illustrating the story of Bijan and Manijay. Iran, late 12th century. Friar Gallery of Art. Traditional historiography in Iran has claimed that FERDOWSI was grieved by the fall of the Sassanid Empire and its subsequent rule by Arabs and Turks. The Shahname, the argument goes, is largely his effort to preserve the memory of Persia's golden days and transmit it to a new generation, so that, by learning from it, they could acquire the knowledge needed to build a better world. 9. Although most scholars have contended that FERDOWSI's main concern was the preservation of the pre-Islamic legacy of myth and history, a number of authors have formally challenged this view. Mythical age. Page from the Florence Shahname, the oldest known Shahname manuscript. Anatolia, 1217. National Central Library of Florence. This portion of the Shahname is relatively short, amounting to some 2,100 verses or 4% of the entire book, and it narrates events with the simplicity, predictability, and swiftness of a historical work. After an opening in praise of God and wisdom, the Shahname gives an account of the creation of the world and of man as believed by the Sasanians. This introduction is followed by the story of the first man, Kiamaz, who also became the first king after a period of mountain dwelling. His grandson Hushang, son of Siamik, accidentally discovered fire and established the Sadeh feast in its honor. Stories of Tamaraz, Jamshid, Zahik, Kawa or Kava, Feridun and his three sons Sam, Tur, and Araj, and his grandson Manacher are related in this section. Heroic age. Almost two-thirds of the Shahname is devoted to the age of heroes, extending from Manacher's reign until the conquest of Alexander the Great. This age is also identified as the Kingdom of Cairnian, which established a long history of heroic age in which myth and legend are combined. The main feature of this period is the major role played by the Saka or Sistani heroes who appear as the backbone of the empire. Garshasp is briefly mentioned with his son Nariman, whose own son Sam acted as the leading paladin of Manucher while reigning in Sistan in his own right. His successors were his son Zal and Zal's son Rostam, the bravest of the brave, and then Faramaz. Among the stories described in this section are the romance of Zal and Rudaba, the 7 stages, or labors, of Rostam, Rostam and Sorab, Siavash and Sudaba, Rostam and Akvan Div, the romance of Bijan and Manijay, the wars with Afrasiab, Dakiki's account of the story of Goshtasp and Ahasp, and Rostam and Esfandar. Bahram Gur kills a dragon in India, folio from the first small Shahnama. Possibly Tabriz, c. 1300. Chester Beatty Library. Historical age. A brief mention of the Arsacid dynasty follows the history of Alexander and precedes that of Ardashir I, founder of the Sasanian Empire. After this, Sasanian history is related with a good deal of accuracy. The fall of the Sassanids and the Arab conquest of Persia are narrated romantically. Message. According to Jalal Khaligi Mutlaq, the Shahnameh teaches a wide variety of moral virtues, like worship of one God, religious uprightness, patriotism, love of wife, family and children, and helping the poor. Influence on Persian language. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. Find sources. Shahnameh, News, Newspapers Book Scholar JSTOR, March 2022. Learn how and when to remove this template message. The Bir of Iskander, folio from the Great Mongol Shahnameh. Tabriz, c. 1330. Friar Gallery of Art. After the Shahnameh, a number of other works similar in nature surfaced over the centuries within the cultural sphere of the Persian language. Without exception, all such works were based in style and method on the Shahnameh, but none of them could quite achieve the same degree of fame and popularity. Some experts, who believe the main reason the modern Persian language today is more or less the same language as that of Ferdowsi's time over 1,000 years ago is due to the very existence of works like the Shahnameh, which have had lasting and profound cultural and linguistic influence. In other words, the Shahnameh itself has become one of the main pillars of the modern Persian language. Studying Ferdowsi's masterpiece also became a requirement for achieving mastery of the Persian language by subsequent Persian poets, as evidenced by numerous references to the Shahnameh in their works. Although 19th-century British Iranologist E.G. Brown has claimed that Ferdowsi purposefully avoided Arabic vocabulary, this claim has been challenged by modern scholarship, specifically Muhammad Moinvar, who has noted that there are numerous examples of Arabic words in the Shahnameh which are effectively synonyms for Persian words previously used in the text. This calls into question the idea of Ferdowsi's deliberate eschewing of Arabic words. The Shahnameh has 62 stories, 990 chapters, and some 50,000 rhyming couplets, making it more than 3 times the length of Homer's Iliad, and more than 12 times the length of the German Nibelungenlied. According to Ferdowsi himself, the final edition of the Shahnameh contains some 60,000 distichs. But this is a round figure. Most of the relatively reliable manuscripts have preserved a little over 50,000 distichs. Nezami-e-Aruzi reports that the final edition of the Shahnameh sent to the court of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni was prepared in 7 volumes. Cultural influence. Rostam kills the Turanian hero Alkes with his lance, folio from the Jainesque Shahnama. Western India, c. 1425 to 1450. The David Collection. The Shirvanshah dynasty adopted many of their names from the Shahnameh. The relationship between Shirvanshah and his son, Manucher, is mentioned in Chapter 8 of Nizami's Lili-o-Majnun. Nizami advises the king's son to read the Shahnameh and to remember the meaningful sayings of the wise. According to the Turkish historian Mehmet Fuat Köprülü. Indeed, despite all claims to the contrary, there is no question that Persian influence was paramount among the Seljuks of Anatolia. This is clearly revealed by the fact that the sultans who ascended the throne after Giyath al-Din Kai Khosrow I assumed titles taken from ancient Persian mythology, like Kai Khosrow, Kai Kavas, and Kai Kabad, and that Ala al-Din Kai Kabad I had some passages from the Shahnameh inscribed on the walls of Konya and Sivas. When we take into consideration domestic life in the Konya courts and the sincerity of the favor and attachment of the rulers to Persian poets and Persian literature, then this fact, i.e. the importance of Persian influence, is undeniable. Shah Ismail I, d.1524, the founder of the Safavid dynasty of Iran, was also deeply influenced by the Persian literary tradition, particularly by the Shahnameh, which probably explains the fact that he named all of his sons after Shahnameh characters. Dixon and Welch suggest that Ismail's Shahnameh-e-Shahi was intended as a present to the young Tahmasp. 18. After defeating Muhammad Shaibani's Uzbeks, Ismail asked Tatfi, a famous poet from Jam, Khorasan, to write a Shahnameh-like epic about his victories and his newly established dynasty. Although the epic was left unfinished, it was an example of mathnawis in the heroic style of the Shahnameh written later on for the Safavid kings. The Shahnameh's influence has extended beyond the Persian sphere. Professor Victoria Arakelova of Yerevan University states, during the 10 centuries past after Ferdowsi composed his monumental work, heroic legends and stories of Shahnameh have remained the main source of the storytelling for the peoples of this region: Persians, Kurds, Gurans, Talashis, Armenians, Georgians, North Caucasian peoples, etc. On Georgian identity. A battle between Kai Khosrow and Afrasiab, folio from Baysonghori Shahnameh, which is part of the UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. Herat, 1426–1430. Golestan Palace Library. Jamshid Shush. Junashvili remarks on the connection of Georgian culture with that of Shahnameh. The names of many Shahnama heroes, such as Rostam I, Themin, Samai, or Zal I, are found in 11th and 12th century Georgian literature. They are indirect evidence for an old Georgian translation of the Shahnama that is no longer extant. The Shahnama was translated, not only to satisfy the literary and aesthetic needs of readers and listeners, but also to inspire the young with the spirit of heroism and Georgian patriotism. Georgian ideology, customs, and worldview often informed these translations because they were oriented toward Georgian poetic culture. Conversely, Georgians consider these translations works of their native literature. Georgian versions of the Shahnama are quite popular, and the stories of Rostam and Sorab, Orbezian and Maniza became part of Georgian folklore. Farman in the Journal of Persianate Studies. Distinguished scholars of Persian such as Jakaria and Todua are well aware that the inspiration derived from the Persian classics of the 9th to the 12th centuries produced a cultural synthesis, which saw, in the earliest stages of written secular literature in Georgia, the resumption of literary contacts with Iran, much stronger than before. Jakaria, 2001, p. 481. Ferdowsi's Shahnama was a never-ending source of inspiration, not only for high literature, but for folklore as well. Almost every page of Georgian literary works and chronicles contains names of Iranian heroes borrowed from the Shahnama, Ivid. Ferdowsi, together with Nezami, may have left the most enduring imprint on Georgian literature. On Turkic identity. Despite a belief held by some, the Turanians of Shahnameh, whose sources are based on Avesta and Pahlavi texts, have no relationship with Turks. The Turanians of Shahnameh are an Iranian people representing Iranian nomads of the Eurasian steppes and have no relationship to the culture of the Turks. Turan, which is the Persian name for the areas of Central Asia beyond the Oxus up to the 7th century, where the story of the Shahnameh ends, was generally an Iranian-speaking land. According to Richard Fry, the extent of influence of the Iranian epic is shown by the Turks, who accepted it as their own ancient history as well as that of Iran. The Turks were so much influenced by this cycle of stories that in the 11th century AD we find the Karakhani dynasty in Central Asia calling itself the family of Afrasiab, and so it is known in the Islamic history. Turks, as an ethno-linguistic group, have been influenced by the Shahnameh since advent of Seljukas. Tokrul III of Seljuks is said to have recited the Shahnameh while swinging his mace in battle. According to Ibn Bibi, in 618 1221, clarification needed, the Saljuk of Ramela, al-Din Kaikabad decorated the walls of Konya and Sivas with verses from the Shahnameh. The Turks themselves connected their origin not with Turkish tribal history, but with the Turan of Shahnameh. Specifically in India, through the Shahnameh, they felt themselves to be the last outpost tied to the civilized world by the thread of Iranianism. Legacy. Kai Khosrow and Faraburs, folio from the Big Head Shahnameh. Gilan, 1493–1494. British Museum. Ferdowsi concludes the Shahnameh by writing, "I've reached the end of this great history. And all the land will talk of me. I shall not die, these seeds I've sown will save my name and reputation from the grave. And men of sense and wisdom will proclaim, when I have gone, my praises and my fame." Another translation of by Reza Jamshidi Safa. Much I have suffered in these 30 years. I have revived the Ajam with my verse. I will not die then alive in the world. For I have spread the seed of the word. Whoever has sense, path and faith, after my death will send me praise. This prediction of Ferdowsi has come true, and many Persian literary figures, historians and biographers have praised him and the Shahnameh. The Shahnameh is considered by many to be the most important piece of work in Persian literature. Western writers have also praised the Shahnameh and Persian literature in general. Persian literature has been considered by such thinkers as Goethe as one of the four main bodies of world literature. Goethe was inspired by Persian literature, which moved him to write his West Eastern Divan. Goethe wrote, When we turn our attention to a peaceful, civilized people, the Persians, we must, since it was actually their poetry that inspired this work, go back to the earliest period to be able to understand more recent times. It will always seem strange to the historians that no matter how many times a country has been conquered, subjugated and even destroyed by enemies, there's always a certain national core preserved in its character, and before you know it, there re-emerges a long familiar native phenomenon. In this sense, it would be pleasant to learn about the most ancient Persians and quickly follow them up to the present day at an all the more free and steady pace. Biographies. Sargo's Shahname, or biography of important poets and writers, has long been a Persian tradition. Some of the biographies of Ferdowsi are now considered apocryphal. Nevertheless, this shows the important impact he had in the Persian world. Among the famous biographies are Shahname, 4 articles, by Nizami, Marudi-i Samarkandi. Tazkare al-Shuara, the biography of poets, by Dalat Shah-i Samarkandi. Bahestan, Abode of Spring, by Jami. Lubab al-Albab by Muhammad, or Fi. Nata'e al-Afkar by Maulana Muhammad Qudrat Allah. Arafat al-Ashayan by Taqi al-Din, Afadi Balyani. Poets. Feridun tests his sons, miniature by Arkham Iraq from the Shahname of Shah Tahmasp. Aga Khan Museum. Page from the manuscript of Rostamiani, Georgian adaptation of Shahname. Famous poets of Persia and the Persian tradition have praised and eulogized Ferdowsi. Many of them were heavily influenced by his writing and used his genre and stories to develop their own Persian epics, stories and poems. Anvari remarked about the eloquence of the Shahname: he was not just a teacher and we his students. He was like a god and we are his slaves. Asadi Tusi was born in the same city as Ferdowsi. His Shahnama was inspired by the Shahname, as he attests in the introduction. He praises Ferdowsi in the introduction and considers Ferdowsi the greatest poet of his time. Masood Saad Salman showed the influence of the Shahname only 80 years after its composition by reciting its poems in the Ghaznavid court of India. Othman Mokhtari, another poet at the Ghaznavid court of India, remarked, "Alive is Rustam through the epic of Ferdowsi, else there would not be a trace of him in this world." Sanai believed that the foundation of poetry was really established by Ferdowsi. Nizami Ganjavi was influenced greatly by Ferdowsi, and 3 of his 5 treasures had to do with pre-Islamic Persia. His Khosrow-o-Shiran, Haft-Pekar and Eskandar-Name used the Shahname as a major source. Nizami remarks that Ferdowsi is the wise sage of Tus, who beautified and decorated words like a new bride. Kakani, the court poet of the Shirvan Shah, wrote of Ferdowsi: "The candle of the wise in this darkness of sorrow." The pure words of Ferdowsi of the Tusi are such. His pure sense is an angelic birth. Angelic born is anyone who's like Ferdowsi. Atta wrote about the poetry of Ferdowsi: "Open eyes and through the sweet poetry see the heavenly Eden of Ferdowsi." In a famous poem, Sadi wrote, "How sweetly has conveyed the pure-natured Ferdowsi. May blessing be upon his pure resting place. Do not harass the ant that's dragging a seed, because it has life and sweet life is dear." In the Bahestan, Jami wrote, "He came from Tus and his excellence, renown and perfection are well known." Yes, what need is there of the panegyrics of others to that man who has composed verses as those of the Shahname? Many other poets, e.g. Hafiz, Rumi and other mystical poets, have used imageries of Shahname heroes in their poetry. Persian historiography. The Shahname's impact on Persian historiography was immediate, and some historians decorated their books with the verses of Shahname. Below is sample of 10 important historians who have praised the Shahname and Ferdowsi. The unknown writer of the Tariq Sistan, History of Sistan, written around 1053. The unknown writer of Majmal al-Tawarik wa al-Qasas, c. 1126. Muhammad Ali Ravandi, the writer of the Rahat al-Sadua wa Ayat al-Surur, c. 1206. Ibn Bibi, the writer of the history book, Al-Awamir al-Aliyah, written during the era of Ala ad-Din K. Gobad. Ibn Esfandiar, the writer of the Tariq-e-Tabestan. Muhammad Juwayni, the early historian of the Mongol era in the Tariq-e-Jahan Gushe, Ilkhanid era. Hamdullah Mostofi Kazwini also paid much attention to the Shahname and wrote the Zafarnama based on the same style in the Ilkhanid era. Hafiz-e-Abru, 1430, in the Majma al-Tawarik. Quan Mir in the Habab al-Siyah, c. 1523, praised Ferdowsi and gave an extensive biography on Ferdowsi. The Arab historian Ibn Athir remarks in his book, Al-Kamal, that, if we name it the Quran of Ajam, we have not said something in vain. If a poet writes poetry and the poems have many verses, or if someone writes many compositions, it will always be the case that some of their writings might not be excellent. But in the case of Shahnameh, despite having more than 40,000 couplets, all its verses are excellent. Illustrated copies. Gushtas displays his prowess at polo before the Khazar of Rum, folio from the Pek Shahnama. Shiraz, 1589–1590. Princeton University Library. Illustrated copies of the work are among the most sumptuous examples of Persian miniature painting. Several copies remain intact, although two of the most famous, the Horton Shahnameh and the Great Mongol Shahnameh, were broken up for sheets to be sold separately in the 20th century. A single sheet from the former was sold for £904,000 in 2006. The Baisonghori Shahnameh, an illuminated manuscript copy of the work, Golestan Palace, Iran, is included in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register of Cultural Heritage Items. The Mongol rulers in Iran revived and spurred the patronage of the Shahnameh in its manuscript form. Great Mongol, or Damot Shahnameh, produced during the reign of the Ilkhanid Sultan Abu Sa'id, is one of the most illustrative and important copies of the Shahnameh. The Timurids continued the tradition of manuscript production. For them, it was considered de rigueur for the members of the family to have personal copies of the epic poem. Consequently, three of Timur's grandsons, Baisongor, Ibrahim Sultan, and Muhammad Juki, each commissioned such a volume. 55. Among these, the Baisonghor Shahnameh commissioned by Giat al-Din Baisongor is one of the most voluminous and artistic Shahnameh manuscripts. The production of illustrated Shahnameh manuscripts in the 15th century remained vigorous during the Kara Koyunlu or Black Sheep, 1380–1468, and Aq Koyunlu or White Sheep, 1378–1508, Turkmen dynasties. Many of the extant illustrated copies, with more than 70 or more paintings, are attributable to Tabriz, Shiraz, and Baghdad beginning in about the 1450s to 60s and continuing to the end of the century. The Safavid era saw a resurgence of Shahnameh productions. Shah Ismail I used the epic for propaganda purposes, as a gesture of Persian patriotism, as a celebration of renewed Persian rule, and as a reassertion of Persian royal authority. The Safavids commissioned elaborate copies of the Shahnameh to support their legitimacy. Among the high points of Shahnameh illustrations was the series of 250 miniatures commissioned by Shah Ismail for his son's Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp. Two similar cycles of illustration of the mid-17th century, the Shahnameh of Rashida and the Windsor Shahnameh, come from the last great period of the Persian miniature. In honor of the Shahnameh's millennial anniversary, in 2010 the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge hosted a major exhibition, called Epic of the Persian Kings, The Art of FERDOWSI's Shahnameh, which ran from September 2010 to January 2011. The Arthur M. Sackler Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. also hosted an exhibition of folios from the 14th through the 16th centuries, called Shahnama, 1000 Years of the Persian Book of Kings, from October 2010 to April 2011. In 2013 Hamid Rahmanian illustrated a new English translation of the Shahnameh, translated by Ahmad Sadri, creating new imagery from old manuscripts. Modern editions. Illuminated frontispiece, Salor, from the Shahnameh of Shah Abbas, made by Zain al-Abidin Tabrizi. Kazvan, c. 1590–1600. Chester Beatty Library. Esfandiar's Fifth Trial, he slays the Simurgh, folio from the Shahnameh in the Kangra style. Kangra, 1695. Chester Beatty Library. Rostam kills the White Div, illustration from the Shahnameh-i Kajiri, first Iranian lithographed Shahnameh. Tehran, 1851–53. Bavarian State Library. Scholarly editions. Scholarly editions have been prepared of the Shahnameh. In 1808 Matthew Lumsden, 1777–1835, undertook the work of an edition of the poem. The first of 8 planned volumes was published in Kolkata in 1811. But Lumsden didn't finish any further volumes. In 1829 Turner Machen published the first complete edition of the poem. It was based on a comparison of 17 manuscript copies. Between 1838 and 1878, an edition appeared by French scholar Julius von Moll, which was based on a comparison of 30 manuscripts. After Moll's death in 1876, the last of its 7 volumes was completed by Charles Barbier de Maynard, Moll's successor to the chair of Persian of the Collège de France. Both editions lacked critical apparatuses and were based on secondary manuscripts dated after the 15th century, much later than the original work. Between 1877 and 1884, the German scholar Johann August Wallers prepared a synthesized text of the Machen and Moll editions under the title FERDOWSI Liber Regum, but only 3 of its expected 9 volumes were published. The Wallers edition was later completed in Tehran by the Iranian scholars S. Nafisi, Iqbal, and M. Manoui for the Millennial Jubilee of Ferdowsi, held between 1934 and 1936. The first modern critical edition of the Shahnameh was prepared by a Russian team led by E. Bertels, using the oldest known manuscripts at the time, dating from the 13th and 14th centuries, with heavy reliance on the 1276 manuscript from the British Museum and the 1333 Leningrad manuscript, the latter of which has now been considered a secondary manuscript. In addition, 2 other manuscripts used in this edition have been so demoted. It was published in Moscow by the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR in 9 volumes between 1960 and 1971. For many years, the Moscow edition was the standard text. In 1977, an early 1217 manuscript was rediscovered in Florence. The 1217 Florence manuscript is one of the earliest known copies of the Shahnameh, predating the Mughal invasion and the following destruction of important libraries and manuscript collections. Using it as the chief text, Jalal Khaligi Motla began the preparation of a new critical edition in 1990. The number of manuscripts that were consulted during the preparation of Khaligi Motla edition goes beyond anything attempted by the Moscow team. The critical apparatus is extensive and a large number of variants for many parts of the poem were recorded. The last volume was published in 2008, bringing the 8-volume enterprise to completion. According to Dick Davis, professor of Persian at Ohio State University, it is, by far the best edition of the Shahnameh available, and it is surely likely to remain such for a very long time. Arabic translation. The only known Arabic translation of the Shahnameh was done in c. 1220 by al-Fath bin Ali al-Bondari, a Persian scholar from Isfahan, and at the request of the Ayyubid ruler of Damascus al-Muazzam Isa. The translation is nath, unrhyming, and was largely forgotten until it was republished in full in 1932 in Egypt, by historian Abdul Wahab Azam. This modern edition was based on incomplete and largely imprecise fragmented copies found in Cambridge, Paris, Astana, Cairo and Berlin. The latter had the most complete, least inaccurate and well-preserved Arabic version of the original translation by al-Bondari. English translations. There have been a number of English translations, almost all abridged. James Atkinson of the East India Company's Medical Service undertook a translation into English in his 1832 publication for the Oriental Translation Fund of Great Britain and Ireland, now part of the Royal Asiatic Society. Between 1905 and 1925, the brothers Arthur and Edmund Warner published a translation of the complete work in 9 volumes, now out of print. There are also modern incomplete translations of the Shahnameh. Reuben Levy's 1967 prose version, later revised by Armin Banani, and another by Dick Davis in a mixture of poetry and prose which appeared in 2006. 67. Also a new English translation of the book in prose by Ahmad Sadri was published in 2013.